Her grandson called her a squatter in the guest house she once paid to remodel. Teresa Vaughn, retired dental hygienist and widow, didn't raise her voice. Logan, the boy she helped raise after his mother left, smirked and changed the Wi-Fi password. By Thursday, the main house was sold, the papers signed, and the guest house legally his. She left him exactly what he claimed: a title, 4 walls, and a broken shower. And when he asked what happened, the escrow officer handed him the answer. "Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe." The door creaked open without a knock. Lois didn't even glance up. She knew that rhythm now. 3 fast steps over the threshold, the careless way his boots dragged on the welcome mat she'd once picked out herself. Gavin stood there, half-lit by the morning sun, sunglasses pushed up into his perfect over-gelled hair. He swept his eyes over the space like a realtor bored by his own listing. Behind him, Jenna's laugh rang out from the patio, sharp, brittle, amused. Gavin muttered it like a throwaway. "Can't believe you're still squatting here." The air left the room so subtly, it felt like nothing at all. Lois didn't look at him. She kept stirring her tea, slow and silent, but her hand gripped the cup with a quiet fury. Bone-white knuckles, porcelain trembling just enough to betray her. At the dining nook, Noah looked up from his cereal. Their eyes met. He froze. Then, without a word, he dropped his gaze and scraped his spoon quietly against the bowl. The sound filled the silence Gavin had left behind as he strutted back out the door. Lois took a sip, even though the tea had gone lukewarm. She swallowed it like it was steel. That evening, she opened the hallway closet, pulled down a dusty fireproof box, and laid it on the guest house kitchen table. She flipped through manila folders and brittle papers until her fingers stopped. There it was. Whitaker, Lois M. Title and deed original record. No liens, no co-signers, no joint ownership, just her name. She sat for a long while staring at it, not rereading, just remembering. The whispers when she first offered to move into the guest house, the sideways glances from Jenna during family dinners, the way Gavin's tone had shifted over the years, professional, dismissive, transactional, like she was furniture that hadn't been staged properly. She ran her thumb over the notary seal. It felt raised, rough, real. The phone rang once before Ruth picked up. "Lo? I think I'm ready to take the next step," Lois said, her voice steady. There was a pause on the other end, then Ruth's familiar chuckle. "Took him long enough to say something stupid enough to wake you up. He called me a squatter. Then he can live with the consequences of mistaking silence for surrender." Lois smiled, just a little, not out of satisfaction, out of recognition. She set the deed flat on the table, then reached for a legal pad. She began to write, not fast, not furious, but with the slow, deliberate pressure of someone who's been underestimated for too long and is finally done, pretending that comfort and compliance are the same thing. From the main house, laughter floated again through the open window. Jenna, probably scrolling through Instagram, maybe sipping wine that Lois had once bought in bulk from the local vineyard before the Whitakers decided they were Pinot people now. Noah knocked once on the screen door. "Grandma?" Lois flipped the deed face down and gave him a soft smile. "Come in, sweetheart." He hesitated. "Dad didn't mean—" "Yes," she cut in gently. "He did." Noah's face flushed red. He looked like he wanted to say something more, but he just gave a small nod, walked over, and hugged her without another word. She hugged him back, one hand protectively at the back of his head. "Go finish your homework," she murmured. "Big things ahead for you." He left, confused but comforted. As the sun dipped behind the hills of Temecula, bathing the guest house in amber light, Lois stood up and walked to the window. From here the main house looked distant. Grand, yes, but hollow. A facade. She looked down at the deed still sitting on the table. Her name, just hers, the final word on the matter. She whispered, not to herself, but to the walls that had heard everything. "Let's begin." The office sat above a wine bar downtown, tucked between a pottery studio and a Pilates place that never seemed to open before noon. Lois climbed the narrow staircase slowly, her knee clicking on the third step like always. She clutched a leather folder to her chest, the kind Gavin used to mock. Teacher tote, he'd called it once, back when she still flinched. The door to Green and Associates was cracked just slightly. The gold-embossed lettering gleamed against frosted glass. Inside, the air smelled like old paper, lemon polish, and something sharp. Eucalyptus, maybe. Clean, watchful. Ms. Green didn't rise from her desk when Lois entered. She simply looked up over her glasses and said, "You're right on time." Lois closed the door behind her and sat across from the woman who, for 2 decades, had been the quiet engine behind a dozen estate battles in the county. Her hair was graying with intention, her blazer crisp, her expression unreadable. "I want to sell the property," Lois said simply. Green tilted her head slightly. "The entire parcel?" Lois opened the folder. Deed, receipts, home improvement invoices, 5 years of property tax statements, organized by year, clipped, annotated. She'd taught freshman English for 32 years. She knew how to build a case. "Every dollar came from me. He never paid a cent, not for the plumbing, not for the roofing, not even the storm drain reroute after that flash flood." Green flipped slowly through the documents. "You're the sole title holder. No lien, no shared ownership, not even a survivorship clause." Lois nodded once. "Then I assume we can move forward discreetly." "We'll start with an NDA," Green said, "and I'll walk you through off-market channels. We don't need Gavin finding out until the ink's dry." Lois allowed herself one breath, then another. It wasn't relief. It was alignment. A subtle rebalancing, like her spine had shifted a fraction into place. Back at the Guesthouse that night, she set up a seller's profile through a site Ms. Green had recommended, one that filtered out gawkers and gossip mongers. Password protected. No photos yet. Just coordinates and a contact alias, LMW Holdings. She stared at the screen longer than necessary, fingers resting on the keys. Her cursor blinked beside the field labeled "Reason for Sale." She typed nothing, closed the tab. The next afternoon, Ruth shuffled in holding a bakery box and a local zoning map folded like origami. "Brought lemon bars," she announced, dropping them and the map onto the kitchen table. "And a name." Lois raised an eyebrow. "A name?" "Guy with a vineyard a few ridges over. Expanding his hospitality offerings, whatever that means. You'd hate him." Lois smiled. "Why's that?" "Because he's got Gavin's exact smile, but he puts it to use legally." They laughed, an honest one this time, not loud but real, like dry kindling finally catching flame. Lois leaned in. "Does he like irony?" Ruth poured them both some coffee. "He worships it." The knock came later than usual. No announcement, just the door swinging open like it had a revolving hinge and not a boundary. Gavin. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, hands on his hips, scanning the kitchen like he felt something out of place. His gaze landed on the open laptop and lingered a beat too long. "What's with the site?" he asked casually, nodding toward the screen. "Recipe forum," Lois lied, without blinking. "Trying to bake something that doesn't taste like Jenna's protein muffins." Gavin smirked. "Good luck. Even the dog won't touch those." She sipped her coffee, watching him over the rim. He was sniffing, not with his nose, but his instincts. Something had shifted, and he didn't know what. "You need something?" she asked. He rubbed his neck. "Number just checking in." "You seem busy." "I am." A long pause. Too long. "Okay then," he muttered, tapping twice on the doorframe as he backed out. "See you around." Lois waited a full 30 seconds after the door shut before turning the screen back toward her. The buyer profile had a notification. One new inquiry. Request for off-market tour attached was a note. Love the acreage. Curious about zoning flexibility. Would want to keep the guest house untouched. She leaned back in her chair, eyes fixed on the screen. Slowly, her mouth curved into something sharp and satisfied. Jenna's voice carried through the thin guesthouse walls early Friday morning. Sharp consonants, tight vowels, packing lists shouted like commands. Tripod, drone, charger, filters. "Gavin, where's the backup mic?" Lois didn't move from her reading chair. She heard everything. She always had. By noon, the black Escalade rolled down the gravel drive, loaded to the brim with ring lights and branded water bottles. Gavin honked twice, not at anyone, just for effect, and the tires spat dust as they disappeared toward L.A. for their weekend shoot. Lois didn't close the blinds. She stood instead, stretched her knees until they clicked, and dialed. "Ready when you are," she told Ms. Green. 2 hours later, a black sedan crept up the road. It didn't stop at the main house. It turned instead toward the guest house, tucked just far enough back to look like an afterthought. Lois opened the door before the knock came. A man in his late 50s stepped out. His sunglasses reflected the oak trees behind her, and he offered a firm, unhurried handshake. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said. "Lovely spot." She nodded once. "Let's take a walk." They moved across the property in slow arcs. Lois pointing, the developer asking occasional questions. Ms. Green followed silently, clipboard in hand, her presence just loud enough to signal professionalism, but quiet enough not to intrude. No cameras, no posted signs, no neighbors notified. Inside the main house, the air was stale with vacancy and lavender diffusers. The man walked through each room with the eye of someone calculating ROI in square footage, not sentiment. "So what's your vision for it?" Lois asked finally, standing in the center of the oversized kitchen. "Corporate retreats," he replied. "People are sick of hotels. They want something curated but with space, something serene." Lois smirked. "Well, there's Serenity. And then there's Jenna." He laughed, caught off guard. Lois took a step closer. "I'll consider a price reduction on one condition." His eyebrow arched slightly. "You leave the guest house alone. It stays as is. No renovations, no leasing, no access." Ms. Green didn't flinch. She'd already drafted the clause. The man studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "That can be arranged." By dusk, the sedan pulled away. Lois walked back toward the guest house, her hands deep in her sweater pockets, her eyes scanning the property line like she was already seeing fences that didn't exist yet. Inside, she kicked off her shoes, turned on the kettle, and froze. The floor creaked. Noah stood near the bookshelf, school bag still on one shoulder, earbuds dangling from his collar. His expression was unreadable. Lois blinked. "Didn't expect you back till Sunday. Dad left my charger, came to get it." His eyes flicked toward the window. "Who was that guy?" Lois poured hot water into a mug. "A developer. For—" She turned and met his gaze, calm and clear. "Just selling what's mine." There was no tremor in her voice, no apology. Noah didn't reply right away. He stepped forward and hugged her. No hesitation, no questions, just warmth, solid teenage sincerity that made her chest catch. "I'm proud of you," he murmured. She pulled back slightly. "For what?" "For remembering who you are." A quiet smile played across her lips. He grabbed his charger from the kitchen drawer and started to leave, but stopped at the door. "You think they'll be mad?" "They're always mad," she said. "They just like new reasons." Noah laughed softly, then slipped out. Lois stood alone again, her mug steaming in her hands, the house wrapped in a silence that finally felt earned. She walked to her laptop and opened the seller dashboard. A new offer had come in, stronger than expected, with contingencies she could live with. She clicked Preview Contract. It was the tone of the gravel that warned her first, the frantic crunch of tires speeding across the driveway too fast for safety, too loud for anything but anger. Lois had just set the kettle on the stove when the door burst open behind her. The handle struck the wall with a hollow thud. Gavin's voice followed, sharp as shattered glass. "You're out of your mind." He didn't wait for her to turn. He marched in like a man walking into his own house, though the deed in her desk drawer said otherwise. In his hand, he clutched his phone, screen still aglow. An unread email from Green & Associates open in the notification preview. "You're selling the whole goddamn property? Without even talking to me first?" His voice cracked on the last word, but he didn't seem to notice. He was too busy pacing, too busy flailing his arms in disbelief, too busy trying to outshout the quiet in her kitchen. Lois didn't look startled. She simply turned the stove off, moved the kettle aside, and faced him with a patience honed by decades of ignoring tantrums dressed as confidence. "I never said I was staying here, Gavin. That was your assumption." He scoffed. "That's not an answer." She crossed the room slowly, as if she were approaching a child mid-meltdown. "You assumed I would live quietly out back while you and Jenna curated your little empire up front. You called me a squatter in my own home. So no, this isn't sudden. It's overdue." The screen door slapped open behind him before he could answer. Jenna stepped in wearing mirrored sunglasses and fury on her face. She peeled the glasses off dramatically, as if the problem were optical and not legal. "You can't do this, Lois," she snapped. "It's not just yours anymore. It's a family home." Lois tilted her head slightly. "A family home," she repeated, as if tasting the phrase. "You've made it very clear I'm not part of the image you two have been staging here." Jenna folded her arms. "We've built our brand around this house. Then I suggest you build a new one somewhere you actually pay the mortgage," Lois said, her voice still level, but edged now with something sterner, something final. Gavin moved toward the dining table and jabbed a finger at her laptop, which still sat open from the night before. "You think you can just do all this behind our backs? List the house? Take offers? You don't even know what you're doing!" Lois sat slowly, folding her hands on the placemat in front of her. "I know enough to have Ms. Green drafting the contract as we speak." As if summoned by name, her phone buzzed. She didn't look away from Gavin as she answered it, putting the call on speaker. "Lois," came Ms. Green's composed voice. "I've completed the first draft of the agreement. Buyer is enthusiastic. Contingencies are minimal. Ready for your signature whenever you are." Lois smiled faintly. "Thank you. I'll stop by tomorrow." Gavin's mouth opened, then closed. Behind him, Jenna looked genuinely rattled for the first time, not angry, but unnerved, as though the foundation beneath her social climbing dreams had shifted 2 inches overnight. He drew himself up. "Then I guess I'll call my own lawyer." A new voice cut in from the doorway. "Tell him to check the title first." Ruth Delgado walked in without invitation, her cardigan slipping off one shoulder, a grocery bag slung over her forearm. She looked between them like she'd just stumbled into a matinee she'd already seen twice. "I was there when she filed it," Ruth added casually, moving toward the sink. "No joint signatures, no trust transfers, no tricky little clauses." Jenna stared, open-mouthed. "Are you serious right now?" "Deadly," Ruth said. "Which, ironically, is the only time you'd have gotten this place, if she'd died quietly instead of waking the hell up." Lois stood. "I suggest you both get your things in order. It's moving faster than even I expected." Jenna's face went crimson. "You'll regret this." "I already regret letting it go this long," Lois replied. Gavin didn't speak. He turned abruptly, grabbed a folder from the counter, one of several Lois had left out deliberately, and stormed out. The door slammed behind him like a closing argument. Jenna lingered half a second longer, her mouth twitching but no words came. Then she turned and followed. Only when the quiet returned did Ruth set the grocery bag down. "That wasn't the real deed folder, was it?" she asked, one eyebrow raised. Lois shook her head, lips curling faintly. "Decoy. I figured he'd do something theatrical." Ruth pulled out a bottle of sparkling water and popped it open. "You're finally having fun with this, aren't you?" Lois didn't answer. She just walked to the window, looked out at the hills beyond the house, and smiled like someone who knew exactly where the next move landed. Lois sat alone at the dining table in the guest house, her reading glasses slipping slightly down her nose as she reviewed the latest draft of the contract. The document glowed on her laptop screen, its language cool, precise, and final. The cursor blinked near the bottom, just above the line marked Special Conditions. She sipped her chamomile tea, then reached for the keyboard. Buyer retains right to subdivide parcel. Guesthouse parcel excluded from transfer. Retained by current title holder, L.M. Whitaker. She paused, reread the sentence twice, then clicked save. Across the room, the wall clock ticked steadily, each second landing with purpose. Outside, the trees rustled gently under a light Temecula breeze. The calm felt almost theatrical, as if the land itself had been waiting for this long-delayed reordering. By noon, Ms. Green had reviewed the edits, approved them without note, and forwarded the amended version to the buyer's legal team. 3 hours later, escrow was opened. Lois received the confirmation in a brief, clinical email, but she read it as if it were poetry. For the first time in years, something belonged entirely to her future, and none of it to Gavin's. She spent the evening handwriting letters. They were not emotional. They were not bitter. They were businesslike, dated and signed. The one addressed to Gavin was the shortest. Effective 30 days from today's date, please consider this formal notice to vacate the main residence located at 12,305 Granite Hill Road. Escrow is now open. Any unauthorized interference with sale proceedings will be handled legally. She folded the letter crisply, sealed the envelope, and left it on the console table in the main house's foyer early the next morning. A quiet offering of truth, unwrapped, undeniable. But it wasn't the letter that sparked the explosion. It was Jenna. Noah had come home early from track practice, earbuds in, still sweating through his school hoodie. He'd walked into the kitchen to find his mother holding a copy of the draft contract in one hand and her cell phone in the other. She wasn't crying. She was fuming. "No mention of Gavin," she hissed, scrolling furiously. "She's not even cutting him in on the sale? Nothing?" Noah blinked. "Wait, you mean he doesn't get anything?" Jenna tossed the phone onto the counter. "She's writing him out like he was never here. She kept the guest house for herself, and the money's going straight into escrow. Your dad looks like a damn fool." Noah stood frozen for a moment. The house felt suddenly smaller, like the walls had inched inward. Then he turned and walked out, cutting across the yard in long, silent strides. He found his father in the garage, half-heartedly rearranging boxes that had never truly been unpacked. Tools clanged somewhere in the background. "Did you really call Grandma a squatter?" Noah's voice was flat, his posture tight. Gavin didn't look up. "It's not personal. It's logistics." Noah took a step forward. "That's what you're going with?" Gavin exhaled through his nose, eyes flicking briefly toward the boy. "She wanted out. I just sped up the process." "You didn't speed it up," Noah said. "You set it on fire." Then he turned and left, leaving his father standing among the things he thought he owned. By Friday, the buyer's attorney had signed off on the final terms. The subdivision clause was locked. The main house and its surrounding acreage would be converted into a boutique corporate retreat, complete with minimal renovations and maximum branding. The guest house, however, 1,500 square feet of the past Gavin had tried to erase, would remain untouched. Untouched and entirely outside his reach. Ms. Green delivered the good news in person, sliding the signed documents across Lois's small kitchen table with the satisfied grace of someone who relished neat endings. "Welcome to your second act," she said. Lois smiled, but her eyes stayed on the line that mattered most, the one that ensured her solitude would never again be mistaken for silence. Later that night, she sat by the window, the lights in the main house glowing across the yard like distant lighthouses. She imagined them packing boxes, shoving curated memories into labeled bins, trying to figure out what went wrong without admitting that it had started going wrong long ago. Her phone buzzed. The message was short, anonymous, but unmistakable. "What happens to us after the 30 days? Where are we supposed to go?" She didn't reply. She simply leaned back, let the silence settle in, and closed her eyes. The sound of cardboard scraping tile had a rhythm to it now, steady, angry, inevitable. Boxes filled the main house like squatters of their own, tucked under windowsills and stacked beside the fireplace Gavin had once used as a background prop for holiday vlogs. Lois watched from the kitchen window of the guest house, sipping coffee she no longer had to pretend to sweeten for guests. The curtains stayed open. Let them see her. Across the yard, Gavin moved like a man rearranging a reality he still hadn't accepted. His face had taken on a permanent flush, the kind that came not from effort, but from insult. Jenna's movements were sharper, more performative, folding sweaters like she was auditioning for an organizing show, muttering loud enough to be heard but not understood. Lois had seen pride unravel before. She'd taught teenagers how to take feedback. But grown adults? That was a different class entirely. On the third day of packing, the Escalade disappeared from the driveway. Jenna didn't say goodbye, just loaded 3 color-coded suitcases and drove off without looking back. Lois watched the taillights vanish down the curved hill and didn't feel relief or triumph, just a steady settling. By Sunday evening, Gavin remained the only occupant of the main house, but his movements had slowed. The storm in his posture had shifted into something colder, smaller, weathered anger reduced to damp frustration. His once pristine designer duffel bag sat by the door like it had given up too. That night, Lois handed a plain manila folder to the mail carrier. Inside were 4 pages, a printed copy of the lease agreement for the guest house, a clause stating the lease was temporary and renewable at Lois's sole discretion. Instructions for utilities Gavin would now be responsible for. A single handwritten note. "Welcome to your new square footage." She didn't need to see him open it. The silence from the main house said enough. 2 days later, she locked the guest house for the final time and walked down the gravel path with 1 bag in each hand. Her new apartment wasn't large, but it was hers. Furnished, modern, quiet. No memory built into the wallpaper, no echoes in the floorboards. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the top floor. She stepped into a space with wide windows, built-in shelves, and a kitchen that overlooked the city's low skyline. The air smelled like lemon oil and possibility. The real estate agent had smiled nervously when Lois signed the lease, asking gently if she needed help moving from such a large estate. "I'm moving forward," Lois had replied, "not backward. That makes it lighter." She unpacked quickly, methodically, books first, framed photo of her husband next, and the potted fern Noah had given her last spring, still thriving despite every reason it shouldn't be. A few days into her new routine, she received an email from Noah. Subject, "Just checking in body." "If I say I miss you already, that doesn't make me disloyal, does it? I'd rather visit you on Saturdays than sit through influencer therapy back home. Let me know if I can stop by." She read it twice before responding. "Come anytime. I have snacks and no staged backdrops. Bring homework if it makes you feel better about it." That weekend, he arrived with a backpack, a sandwich, and a plant for her balcony. They sat in companionable silence, the city buzzing gently below. Later that night, Ruth knocked on the door with a chilled bottle of wine and a foil-wrapped container of lasagna. Her eyes scanned the apartment approvingly as she stepped inside. "Well, damn," she said, setting the food down and pulling out a corkscrew. "I've seen breakups, I've seen buyouts, but I have never—" She popped the cork with a celebratory twist. "Seen a cleaner eviction." Lois smiled and poured 2 glasses. They clinked them gently together. "To doing it your way," Ruth said. "To remembering I could," Lois replied. The apartment filled with quiet laughter, the kind that didn't ask for permission. But across town, back at the property, Gavin stood at the threshold of the guest house holding the lease in one hand and his phone in the other. His inbox was filled with declined listings, unsubscribed subscribers, and 1 flagged notice from the HOA. Unauthorized short-term rentals will be penalized. He stepped inside, shut the door behind him, and looked around the cramped space he'd never once bothered to understand. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was punishing. The hammering began just after dawn. Not loud, not chaotic, just methodical, intentional. The kind of sound that didn't ask for permission because the paperwork had already cleared. Gavin rolled over on the stiff guesthouse mattress, disoriented by the echo of nails driven into wood. At first, he thought someone had finally come to fix the sagging deck near the main house, but as the rhythm intensified, his stomach tightened. He peeled back the curtain. Outside, 3 men in orange vests moved with clinical efficiency along the edge of the gravel path. One held rolled blueprints, another unspooled wire from a reel that clinked like chains. The third carried fence panels in even, practiced strides. They weren't fixing anything. They were building a boundary. He yanked open the door, barefoot, hair unkempt, voice already rising. "Hey, what the hell is this?" The foreman glanced over, mildly surprised by the interruption but not concerned. Perimeter install, according to the parcel split on file, just staking what's been sold. Gavin blinked, as if the term sold had never been meant to apply to something he lived in. You can't just, this isn't part of. He stopped himself. The workers weren't listening. They didn't need to. They had a permit posted on the back of their truck and instructions from a title he no longer held. By noon, the fence had teeth. Thin but tall, it sliced across what used to be a seamless yard. No more strolls to the mailbox, no more drone shots of the vineyard-like expanse. His view now ended in vertical slats and galvanized steel. From the outside, the guest house looked like an afterthought. From the inside, it looked like a cage. He dialed Lois's number with shaking fingers. It rang, and rang. Then voicemail. He tried again. Same result. By the third try, he wasn't even angry. He was pleading. The fourth try, he didn't leave a message. What could he say that didn't sound like an admission? When evening settled, the construction crew packed up, leaving tire marks across the newly divided drive. The main house, now vacant, repurposed and humming with its next phase, seemed to glow with distance. It wasn't his anymore. It never had been, not in the way he'd imagined. He'd confused occupation with ownership. The screen door creaked behind him. No Jenna, not even a text since she left. Just silence and a smell in the kitchen he couldn't place. Something stale, like disuse. He sat down heavily on the guest house steps, shoulders sagging. Across town the air was different, brighter, cleaner, tinged with cut grass and the faint floral note of something recently planted. Noah stood beside Lois on the balcony of her apartment, both of them looking down at 3 clay pots lined neatly along the edge. He held a seed packet in one hand, thumb tapping against the label. "I know it's late in the season, but marigolds are tough." Lois gave him a knowing smile. "Tough is good. I could come by on Sundays," he added. "Help water them, repot if they outgrow these." She looked at him with that quiet kind of pride that didn't need to be spoken aloud. "I'd like that." He hesitated, glancing at the third, empty pot. "You want something else in this one?" She turned back toward the balcony door, letting the breeze lift the edge of her sleeve. "Let's grow things that don't wilt under insult." Noah didn't ask what she meant. He didn't need to. He dropped a handful of soil into the empty pot and pressed his fingers. Down, gently, anchoring the promise. Later that night, after he'd gone and the apartment had returned to its usual hush, Lois sat with her tea and a crossword, not even glancing at the phone that buzzed once across the room. She didn't need to answer it. She already knew who it was, and what he wanted, and what she would no longer give. The first thing Gavin noticed was the light, or rather, the lack of it. He'd positioned his tripod in the guest house's narrow kitchenette, hoping the morning sun would bounce off the Formica counter just right. It didn't. The footage came out dull, flat, and tinged with a yellow cast that made him look sallow. He ran it through a color correction filter, then another, and still couldn't shake the motel room quality of it. No matter where he moved the setup, to the tiny dining nook, to the corner of the living room, even to the makeshift desk by the bathroom door, nothing worked. The guest house wasn't built for angles, it was built for utility. And Gavin, for all his posturing, was not built for authenticity. He recorded 3 takes of a video titled "The Truth About Downsizing," and hated them all. His voice sounded strained, performative, even to himself. He kept referring to the guest house as his creative reset, but the audio picked up the low hum of a neighbor's lawnmower and the echo off the cheap tile backsplash. He uploaded the least embarrassing version anyway. By midnight, the comments had turned. "Wait, where's the main house? Didn't you used to have a wine cellar? Bro, what happened to the walk-in closet? This setup looks kinda sad, NGL." He replied to none of them. He used to answer every top comment, throwing emojis and winks like confetti. Now he just watched the view count slow to a crawl, and the subscriber ticker dip 1 digit, then another. Not catastrophic, but enough to sting. The next day, he opened Instagram and saw that Jenna had quietly removed his tag from their last 12 reels. The branded couple's content was gone. No more modern manner Mondays, no more joint journals, no more double-tap photos of them sipping sangria beside a fireplace they never actually lit. She hadn't unfollowed him, she'd just airbrushed him out of her feed like an outdated filter. He scrolled back through his own archive, half looking for clues, half looking for reasons to feel righteous. Instead, he found himself staring at a video from 6 months ago. Him giving a walking tour of the property, gesturing toward the manicured backyard, calling it an oasis of intentional design. Lois had been pulling weeds in the background, out of focus. He hadn't even noticed her there at the time. He clicked play again, slower this time. There she was, squinting into the sun, gloved hands moving through the soil, completely ignored by the man narrating over her labor. He closed the tab. Somewhere across town, in a quiet apartment with open windows and potted marigolds on the balcony, Lois poured herself a glass of iced tea and sat down at her kitchen table. She'd been sent the link. Not by Noah, of course. He had more tact. But someone from her old book club had forwarded it under the subject line, "Your son's latest project? Thoughts?" She watched only the first 2 minutes, then set her tablet face down with a sigh. "Should have filmed respect," she murmured, almost to herself. That night, Gavin stayed up late, tweaking his website, adjusting fonts, updating his Work With Me page. He added a new tab titled Live Speaking and Guest Appearances and listed topics like building a personal brand through adversity and how to reinvent after a setback. He sent out over a dozen cold emails to conference organizers, podcast hosts, and real estate seminar groups. He even drafted a pitch to a startup that ran virtual summits for disrupted professionals. Only one reply came in. The event was unpaid, virtual, slotted between a mindfulness coach and a guy who sold motivational t-shirts out of a storage unit in Riverside. He accepted. The Guesthouse felt colder that night, and smaller too. He tried to convince himself it was a temporary season, a test of resilience. But the walls didn't echo with ambition anymore. They swallowed it whole. The summons came on a Tuesday, delivered not by mail but by a process server who looked vaguely amused to be knocking on the warped screen door of a guest house with peeling paint and a makeshift welcome mat that read, "Grind now, shine later." Gavin signed for the envelope with a numb flick of the wrist, barely processing the bold letters stamped across the front. Filing, claim of undue influence/mental coercion, Whitaker versus Whitaker. He stared at it for a long time, then placed it on the kitchen counter next to a cold cup of coffee and a dead laptop charger. The paper looked official, aggressive, something that made him feel like he was doing something again, taking action, grabbing back control. Except he had none. Still, he filed. The claim leaned on vague language, built mostly from implication and frustration, that his mother had taken advantage of his emotional state, that she had orchestrated the sale of family property under duress, that she had used her role as a trusted elder to obscure legal facts. When he read it back aloud, even he didn't believe it, but the words were there and the paperwork was processed. He felt almost victorious filing it, like dragging her into court might shake loose the stalemate he had created for himself. But Lois didn't shake. She didn't even show up. Instead, Ms. Green appeared at the hearing with a box file labeled simply LW-complete. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her early 60s with salt and pepper hair and a bench presence that felt carved from stone, eyed the file with something like curiosity. "Let's proceed," she said without preamble. What followed was quiet devastation. 4 years of financial records, home improvement receipts, property tax logs with Lois's signature and banking details, email chains between her and Gavin showing his disinterest, his flippant replies about repairs being mom's little projects, voicemails transcribed and time-stamped, Gavin laughing about letting the old lady run the place while he filmed content in the master bath. Ms. Green never raised her voice. She didn't need to. She simply laid the facts on the table, one after the other, like turning over clean cards in a losing hand. When it was Gavin's turn to speak, he tried, stammered something about family loyalty, about unspoken understandings, about how no one sells a home out from under their own blood. But his words were paper-thin. His logic had no legal legs to stand on. The judge didn't even deliberate. She closed the folder, removed her glasses, and leaned forward slightly. "This court finds the claim not only meritless," she said, voice measured, "but insulting to the process. Case is dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Whitaker, you will be responsible for all court fees associated with this filing." The gavel cracked once, clean and final. Outside the courthouse, Gavin stood alone on the steps. His suit didn't fit as well as it used to. The shoulder seams pulled awkwardly, like the fabric no longer agreed with the person wearing it. He checked his phone. No texts, no calls. Just a payment reminder from the escrow office and a flagged email from his last credit card. The silence was total. Across town, Lois sat in her attorney's office, signing the last page of an updated estate document. Ms. Green slid it back into a blue folder stamped with the word trust. "You're sure about this?" she asked. Lois nodded. "Noah's name, sole beneficiary, posthumous, all assets." Green didn't smile, but her eyes softened. "He's earned it." Lois gathered her things and stepped outside into the afternoon sun. Ruth was waiting at the curb, sunglasses on, passenger door open, a bag of kettle corn between her knees. "Well?" she asked. Lois slid in, buckled up, and took a handful of popcorn. "It's done." Ruth nodded. "Feels like he got what he asked for. Just less than he expected." They drove in comfortable silence, the road ahead open and clean. Back at the guest house, Gavin stared at the small stack of envelopes on the kitchenette counter. One bore a red stamp that read, "Insufficient funds." Another was from the city, reminding him of new restrictions on accessory dwellings without active utility accounts. He reached for his phone again, as if habit alone could summon answers. There were none. The apartment smelled faintly of rosemary and roasted garlic. Lois moved with quiet precision through the narrow kitchen, her sleeves rolled neatly to the elbows of a dark blue cardigan, the color of calm seas. A pot of linguine simmered gently on the stovetop. In the oven, a loaf of artisan bread baked low and slow, the crust just beginning to crackle at the edges. She opened the silverware drawer, pulled out 4 place settings, and moved to the table. Oak, round, modest in size, but elegant in how it filled the small dining alcove. At its head, propped in a simple pewter frame, sat a photo of Martin, taken 23 years ago in Big Sur. He was wearing a windbreaker 2 sizes too big and smiling with his eyes squinted into the California sun. She adjusted the frame slightly, just enough to face the seat where she would sit. The doorbell rang. First came Ruth, her laugh echoing through the hallway before Lois even opened the door. She wore her signature wide scarf and carried a bottle of wine that looked expensive and tasted cheaper than it claimed. "Couldn't let you run a dinner party without the proper libations," she said, pressing a kiss to Lois's cheek. Maya followed next, Lois's former neighbor from 3 doors down back on Granite Hill. She was shorter than Lois remembered, but her hug was warm and grounding. "You look taller here," she whispered. "Like yourself again." Then Noah. He wore a collared shirt under his hoodie, clearly a compromise with whatever version of the evening he'd been imagining. In his hands, he held a potted orchid in full bloom, white petals tinged with violet edges, each one impossibly symmetrical. "This one blooms all year," he said as he handed it to her. "Figured that was fitting." Lois looked at him, touched more deeply than she let show. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Thank you." They ate slowly, the kind of meal that took its time, with second helpings and stories that had nothing to prove. Ruth toasted midway through the second glass of wine, lifting her glass with a grin and just enough mock gravity to draw attention. "To dignity," she said, glancing around the table, then back at Lois. "Served hot, and deserved." The table chuckled. Lois bowed her head briefly, laughing into her wineglass, and the candlelight made her skin glow warmer than any filter Gavin had ever used. Later, after the dishes were cleared and the leftovers parceled into containers for Noah to take home, the group lingered, refusing to let the night end too quickly. The apartment was small, but the joy inside it felt uncontainable. Something earned, not gifted. Lois sat back in her chair and looked around the room. The marigolds on the balcony glowed under the porch light. The orchid had already claimed a spot on the counter near the sink, and Martin's picture, still watching over the table, seemed less like a memory and more like a quiet approval. As the others bundled up and trickled out into the hallway, Lois stood by the door and hugged each of them tightly. Not goodbye, just see you next time. Noah was the last to leave. He hesitated, then looked back into the apartment one more time. I think he'd be proud of you, he said. I know he would, Lois replied. The door clicked shut, and for a moment the apartment returned to stillness. Lois turned off the lights in the kitchen, leaving only the warm glow of the dining alcove. She poured herself one last inch of wine and stood at the window, watching the city breathe below. Miles away, in the darkened guest house, Gavin stood in front of the microwave, shirt wrinkled, eyes hollow. The screen blinked 30 as a frozen meal spun slowly inside. Chicken Alfredo, now gummy and uneven. He opened the fridge. Half a bottle of unsweetened iced tea, one container of hummus, a wilted bag of spinach he didn't remember buying. He closed it again without reaching for anything. He sat alone at the fold-out table he'd dragged from a storage closet last week. No candlelight, no wine, no one. The tray steamed in front of him, and the hum of the guest house fridge was the only sound in the room. Lois sat at her desk, morning light cutting a clean line across the walnut surface. The orchid Noah had brought her glowed in the corner of the windowsill, its petals open like small flags of defiance. The legal envelope lay in front of her, sealed except for the one space that mattered most, the signature line. Her estate file was already thick with clauses, authorizations, medical directives. This was the final adjustment, the one she'd thought about longer than any of the others. She lifted the pen. With one steady stroke, she removed two names, Gavin R. Whitaker, Jenna P. Whitaker. No appeals, no poetic justifications. Just silence, ink, and resolve. She handed the file to Ms. Green, who had stopped by for coffee and notary stamps. Noah still holds the successor designation? Green asked, flipping through the pages. He does, Lois said, pouring coffee into her favorite chipped mug. And will. You sure about the donation split? I am. Green nodded and began stamping documents. The sound of each seal landing on paper felt oddly ceremonial, like the final chords of a hymn no one had been paying attention to until now. By noon, the paperwork was filed. A portion of the proceeds from the property sale, specifically the section Gavin had never realized he didn't own, had been wired to a statewide senior legal defense fund. The donation wasn't anonymous. Lois had signed her full name on the dedication form, in memory of every quiet elder mistaken for powerless. That afternoon, Noah arrived with a small camera rig and a lavalier mic. It was for a digital media class, short documentary segments on The Turning Point, he'd explained in his email. She hadn't hesitated, not even a little. They recorded in the living room, the city buzzing gently through the balcony doors behind her. She wore her navy cardigan again. No makeup, no coaching, just truth. He sat across from her, the camera centered, the mic clipped to her collar. Okay, he said gently. One question. You ready? She nodded. What was the best decision you ever made? Lois didn't answer right away. She looked down at her hands, slightly knotted now with age but steady as ever, then back up at the lens. Deciding my voice was still legal tender. Noah exhaled quietly behind the camera, a slow smile touching his lips. Cut, he said. That's it. He didn't need a second take. Elsewhere, in the increasingly claustrophobic confines of the guest house, Gavin hunched over his laptop, refreshing the Zillow page for the 7th time that morning. The appraised value blinked back at him in quiet mockery. Guest house parcel, $35,400 condition, unpermitted for independent dwelling use. Status, non-compliant with HOA short-term lease code. Recommendation, not viable as income property. He had tried. Reached out to 3 property managers, listed the space on a rental forum under a fake LLC. 2 interested parties backed out after the first walkthrough. One had laughed. This isn't a guest house, they'd said. This is a shed with better lighting. Yesterday, he received an official letter from the HOA subject. Denial of sublease request reason. Accessory dwelling unit zoning prohibits rental without owner occupancy of main structure. Violation of this policy will result in fines. He had no one left to argue with. No legal ground to threaten. No phone calls to make. The last video he uploaded had 12 views and 1 comment. Damn, remember when this guy had a view? He deleted the channel that night. Across town, Lois watered the balcony plants and opened her inbox. Noah had sent a rough cut of the interview. No music. Just her words against the faint hum of cars in the background. She watched it once, not to edit, but to witness. To remember the sound of her own conviction, recorded on record this time, not shouted, not sentimental. Just said. Her phone buzzed with a notification from a digital real estate alert. She almost ignored it until she saw the listing tag, Whitaker Guest Unit, Local Property Monitor Alert. She clicked. Gavin had relisted the guest house again, this time under Creative Live Work Opportunity. A desperate framing of a space now bordered by a fence and haunted by silence. The invitation came on thick cardstock, cream-colored with gold-embossed lettering that caught the light just so. The City of Temecula Annual Civic Service Brunch, honoring outstanding contributions in legal and civic legacy planning. Lois read it twice before setting it on the windowsill beside her orchid. She hadn't expected recognition, especially not for something that had felt, at the time, like survival more than strategy. The brunch was held in the community events hall next to City Hall, a building that still smelled faintly of pledge and public service. Round tables with white linen cloths filled the room, each topped with centerpieces of sunflowers and rosemary in mason jars. The air buzzed with polite applause and the clinking of cutlery on china. She wore her gray blazer, the one she hadn't touched since Martin's retirement dinner. It still fit, still made her stand a little straighter. Noah came with her, camera slung across his chest, pretending he was there on assignment. Ruth came too, uninvited but inevitable, claiming a chair and a mimosa with the ease of a woman who didn't care for ceremony unless it was deserved. When Lois's name was called, the room applauded politely. When she reached the podium, they listened. She didn't read from notes. "I've spent most of my life thinking that silence was a form of grace," she began, her voice even and clear. That dignity meant letting things slide, keeping the peace, making room. A pause. The room stilled. But silence doesn't mean surrender, and dignity isn't the same as disappearing. She glanced briefly at Noah, who had lowered his camera now, watching, not as a student, but as someone who understood exactly what it had taken for her to get here. "I didn't plan to make a statement. I just stopped waiting for someone else to call what I owned mine." Applause rose slowly, sincere and full. When she stepped down, she didn't rush back to her table. She walked with ease, with weight behind her heels and calm in her shoulders. By the time she reached her seat, Ruth raised her mimosa again and whispered, "Well, damn. Brunch with bite." Lois just smiled. The next morning, the Temecula Gazette ran a feature on the brunch, page B1, just below the fold, "Local Woman Turns Private Estate Battle into Blueprint for Elder Empowerment." The article quoted her directly. Silence doesn't mean surrender, and detailed her donation to the Legal Defense Fund. It included a photo of her at the podium, face framed by soft light and calm determination. By noon, Ms. Green had texted her a screenshot. "You're officially a case study." Underneath, she'd added a gif of Ruth applauding with theatrical exaggeration from the table. Lois responded with a single thumbs up. That was enough. A few counties over, in a dim studio apartment Gavin had temporarily rented after overstaying the guest house lease, the same article popped up on a news alert. He skimmed it without finishing, scrolling too fast to see the quote that would have hurt the most. His eyes flicked across the headline, the photo, the byline. Then, without ceremony, he closed the tab and opened a new one. "How to Apply for Reality TV Casting, 2025 Season." He submitted 2 applications that afternoon, one for a show about home renovations, the other for a series called Redemption Revamp. His application video, shot awkwardly in front of a blank wall, focused on reinventing legacy and healing through design. He used the word pivot 5 times. He was not called back. Jenna, meanwhile, had quietly reinvented herself on Instagram as at Casa Sage. Gone were the couple's photos, the real estate tips, the aspirational kitchen shots. In their place, candle flat lays, reels of her pouring wax into recycled jars, close-ups of eucalyptus bundles and moody lighting. Her new tagline, hand-poured calm for chaotic times. No mention of Gavin. Not in the captions, not in the comments, not even in the tags of old posts. She had burned him from her brand like a wick that no longer served the flame. One of her new candles was called Fresh Start, another, Boundary Line. At the city library that weekend, a high school senior stopped Lois on her way out, holding a folded newspaper and a journal. "I read about you," the girl said, wide-eyed. "Can I quote you for my debate class?" Lois blinked, then smiled softly. "Only if you win." The envelope was thick and hand-delivered, slid under Lois's door on a Saturday morning with a post-it note that read, "Read when you're alone. Trust me. N." She waited until the apartment was quiet again, until the tea steeped dark in her favorite mug and the sun had crept across the living room rug in a soft arc of gold. Then she sat down at the small dining table and pulled the pages from inside. Title: My Grandmother, The Quiet Warrior, by Noah Whitaker. Her breath caught before she even turned the first page. It wasn't an essay so much as a reckoning, measured but unflinching. He wrote about the house, of course, the sale, the fence line, but he also wrote about what came before it. The afternoons he'd overheard Gavin snapping about timelines, the moments Jenna smiled with her eyes narrowed like daggers, the subtle silences that settled in every corner of the house like dust no one wanted to claim. He wrote about the word squatter, how it changed everything, how it cracked something open, and how, instead of shattering, Lois had moved with surgical clarity, making one decision at a time, reclaiming not just property, but presence. He described the smell of her apartment the first time he visited, the way she arranged her bookshelf alphabetically, but always left room for new authors, the way her voice had held when she'd said, "Let's grow things that don't wilt under insult." And then came the final paragraph. "My grandmother didn't start a war. She just stopped losing one. She didn't ask for credit. She asked for clarity, and when no one offered it, she found it anyway. She taught me that survival is not the absence of scars. It's the choice to walk into sunlight knowing exactly where they are. That's power, and I hope I carry it well." Lois folded the last page with shaking hands. Her tears didn't come all at once. Just a quiet misting, the kind that gathered at the edges and refused to be blinked away. Not grief, not even pride, just awe. Gentle, humbling awe that someone had seen her so fully, so clearly, without being told what to look for. That evening, she called Ms. Green. "Can you come by Monday?" she asked. "Something wrong?" Green replied. "Nothing wrong at all," Lois said. "I just want to update the trust." When Green arrived, she brought her rolling briefcase and a soft curiosity. "I'd like to add a provision," Lois explained, opening her binder. "A gift for early graduation." Green raised an eyebrow. "Tuition?" "Number A seed fund." Green sat forward slightly. "For what?" "Whatever he decides not to ask permission for," Lois said simply. "I trust him enough to know that kind of power won't be wasted." They drafted it together, $25,000 to be transferred into a separate account upon Noah's graduation. No restrictions, no earmarks, just a note on file that read, "For the voice you already found, use it freely." As they notarized the final clause, the oven timer dinged in the background. Ruth entered through the balcony door 2 minutes later, holding a glass pie dish wrapped in a dish towel printed with lemons. "I figured it was time," she said, placing it on the table. "It's tart, but not bitter, like some of us." Lois raised an eyebrow. "You bake now?" Ruth shrugged. "I improvise. Besides, lemon pie's for people who don't sour." They ate it with forks straight from the dish, the sun dipping behind the buildings, casting gold along the hardwood. Lois looked at the orchid blooming silently on the windowsill, then at the envelope still sitting on the counter, now folded and returned to its sleeve. Later that night, after Ruth had gone and the lights were low, Lois stood at the window and thought about legacy, not as something written into contracts, but as something passed without permission. She had survived, yes, but more than that, she'd handed the survival off to someone who never once asked for power and would never waste it. The dealership smelled like rubber and coffee. Lois stood in the delivery bay, watching a young attendant in a branded polo wipe down the windshield of a gleaming new hybrid SUV. It was silver, with soft black trim and windows just tinted enough to mute the world a little. She hadn't test-driven many options. This one had felt right the moment she sat in it. Quiet, smooth, no wasted motion, like she'd imagined her next decade might feel. She handed over the keys to her old sedan without ceremony, no backward glances, just a signature, a thank you nod, and the soft clap of paperwork closed. Ruth whistled low as the car pulled around front. "You're officially a woman who doesn't break for sentiment," Lois chuckled, slipping on her sunglasses. "No more rear-view nostalgia, just a full tank and a forward gear." They loaded up the back with 2 modest duffels, a picnic cooler, and a folder of printed directions, just in case the signal dropped in the mountains. Then Lois slid into the driver's seat, adjusted the mirrors, and tapped the GPS screen. Destination: Yosemite National Park. Estimated arrival: 5 hours, 43 minutes. The SUV hummed to life like a secret keeping its promise. As they eased onto the highway, Ruth leaned over and pressed the button to lower all 4 windows. Spring air rushed in, clean, pine-scented, edged with the wild joy of doing something simply because you could. They didn't talk much the first hour. Just let the silence ride with them, broken only by the occasional hum of passing trucks and a playlist Lois had finally let Noah program. Classic soul, some indie rock, and one too many John Mayer tracks. Outside Fresno, Ruth reached into the glove box for snacks and pulled out a bag of trail mix she hadn't remembered packing. "You sure you're not a witch?" she asked, shaking the bag. "This is exactly what I wanted." Lois smiled, eyes on the road. "I prepare, that's all." "Damn right you do." Ruth leaned back, cracking a window wider. "Tell me again why we're doing this trip." Lois glanced sideways, her grin slow and razor clean. "Because I didn't burn a bridge," she said. "I sold the land around it." They both laughed, deep, satisfied, fearless. Somewhere behind them, Gavin sat hunched on a sagging futon in a rental unit that buzzed when the fridge kicked on. He stared at the call log on his phone. 3 outgoing calls. 1 voicemail left. Then, finally, the screen blinked back at him with bitter simplicity. Call blocked. He tossed the phone onto the couch and turned back to his cracked laptop, only to be greeted by a system update that failed to install. The silence in the room didn't echo, it absorbed. Back on the highway, Lois and Ruth pulled off at a scenic overlook above the foothills. The sun was starting to dip, casting gold across the ridgelines. Lois got out, stretched her arms overhead, and took a long breath. The kind of breath that hadn't been stolen by tension or caged by hesitation. Her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. She nearly ignored it. Reflex more than curiosity, but the name stopped her thumb mid-swipe. Noah. She opened the message. Attached was a photo. Noah holding a thick envelope, his smile stretched wide and slightly unbelieving. Behind him, a banner taped across his bedroom wall read, "Congratulations, finalist, West Coast Youth Journalism Fellowship." The text below the photo was simple. "They picked the essay. I'm going. You helped me pack more than I'll ever admit." Lois blinked back something that wasn't quite tears and wasn't quite laughter. She handed the phone to Ruth. Ruth squinted at the screen, then whooped loud enough to startle a nearby crow. "Well, damn. Looks like you've got more than orchids blooming these days." Lois just smiled, wide and soft and fully unguarded. "Good," she said. "It's about time something bloomed on his side of the story." As the SUV pulled back onto the road and wound through the final stretch of rising curves, the horizon opened up, vast and unfiltered. Ruth turned the music up. Lois didn't reach for the volume. She let it play. The song was unfamiliar, but the lyrics drifted in like they'd been waiting. "You don't need a map when you own the road." The email came at 7:18 a.m., just as the city light began to ease its way across the brick wall opposite Lois's apartment window. The subject line was simple: transfer of assets, finalized. She opened it with a still hand, eyes calm, posture unhurried. A single PDF sat inside. She didn't need to click it to know what it said, but she did anyway. The document confirmed what she already felt in her bones. The trust was settled, the disbursements filed, the donor note to the Legal Defense Fund received and publicly acknowledged. Every clause had cleared. Every intent now lived in stone and law. She closed her laptop without logging out. On the counter, next to a blooming orchid and a lemon-patterned trivet Ruth had insisted she keep, sat a padded mailer. Lois opened it slowly. Inside was a wooden frame wrapped in brown tissue. Tucked in the corner was a yellow sticky note written in Noah's distinct slanted hand. Dorm small, but the pride's big. Hope this gets wall space. N. She removed the paper and turned the frame over. It was the essay. My grandmother, the quiet warrior. She read it again, even though she'd nearly memorized every line by now. The paper still smelled faintly of the printer ink, as if it hadn't fully dried in its first life. At the bottom, under the final paragraph, Noah had added a handwritten line. Legacy is not a will, it's a direction. You pointed true north. Lois hung it just beside the front door, so anyone leaving her home would see it. 3 days later, in the last days of August, a manila envelope arrived at the guest house addressed to Mr. Gavin R. Whitaker. He opened it with cautious hands, half expecting another legal blow. What he found was worse. Inside was a lease renewal, printed in clean serif font. 1 page, no cover letter. The rent, $3,200 per month. The final paragraph was the only one that felt personal. Per the subdivision ruling, this lease is governed by independent parcel restrictions. Utilities are tenant responsibility. No subleasing, no amendments. Lease non-negotiable. Renewal deadline, 15 days. L.M. Whitaker. There was no Dear Gavin, no closing line, just the facts. He stood in the center of the guest house, barefoot on the cold tile, the HVAC still off to conserve what little power he could afford. The water pressure had dropped last week, the Wi-Fi was spotty, the space smelled faintly of mildew and an unclaimed future. The only thing that hummed consistently was the refrigerator, which now held a carton of almond milk, a lemon, and nothing else. He looked at the envelope again. $3,200. It was the same number they'd once spent staging the kitchen in the main house for a video series that never launched. He remembered laughing at the invoice then. He wasn't laughing now. Outside the narrow window, a dry breeze swept through the property, kicking dust against the fence line. The yard on the other side was no longer his to imagine. Meanwhile, Lois stood in her apartment, holding one last artifact from a past that no longer had any jurisdiction, the original deed. She'd kept it tucked in a fireproof box all these years, signed, sealed, notarized on crisp courthouse letterhead. It had carried her name before anyone tried to shrink her into a footnote. She didn't cry as she looked at it now. She didn't even smile. She just took a photo. One single shot, the title block in crisp focus. Then she fed the document into her shredder, steady hand guiding each inch down until the past became ribbons. In the silence that followed, she didn't speak, didn't narrate, just breathed, deep, long, certain. At the doorway, the essay hung in quiet witness. On her phone, a final unread message lit up the screen. Unknown number. Probably Gavin, reaching for a lever that no longer existed. She tapped block, then walked to the window. Outside, the city moved as it always had. Indifferent, busy, full of lives she didn't owe anything to. The air smelled like baked asphalt and lemon balm from the planter Noah had left behind. She looked out over it all and finally said the thing she'd never needed to post or perform. He called me a squatter. I called his bluff and built my exit.